I remember the first time I stepped into my daughter-in-law's family home. I acted poor, humble, even a little naive, smiling through the whispers, pretending I did not notice their judging eyes. I thought I was just meeting her family, but I had no idea how cruel they could be. Every smirk, every backhanded comment felt like a tiny cut hand. I kept smiling anyway. But inside, something snapped, because they did not know one thing about me. I never forget. And what I was about to do would leave them speechless. My name is Rachel, and I am 38 years old. I have spent most of my life quietly managing my home, raising my son, and keeping our small family afloat. Life has not been easy, but I have learned to endure, to smile even when my heart aches. When my son got married, I thought it would be a simpler chance to meet his new family, exchange pleasantries, and welcome his wife into our lives. I could not have been more wrong. The first time I walked into their house, I wore a modest dress and carried a small gift. I wanted them to see me as humble, approachable, unassuming. I smiled as I stepped through the door, but I immediately felt their eyes on me, sharp, calculating, heavy with judgment. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive candles. Crystal chandeliers reflected light in sharp angles across the room, emphasizing the perfection of their home. Every detail screamed wealth, refinement, and superiority. And I had none of that to offer. Her mother, Margaret, a tall woman with a sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes, studied me like a hawk. "Oh, you must be Rachel," she said, her tone polite but dripping with barely concealed disdain. "I have heard so much about you." I smiled and nodded, careful to show respect, hiding the simmering anger behind my calm expression. Every word out of her mouth was calculated, every glance a silent reminder that I was beneath her. Her husband, Richard, sitting in a leather armchair, barely acknowledged me, his eyes flicking toward me as though I were an inconvenience in his perfect, orderly life. Then there was my daughter-in-law, Emily. She smiled politely, but even in that smile, there was a trace of superiority, a hint of judgment that made my skin crawl. The younger siblings hovered at the edges, whispering to each other, stealing glances and smirks that made me want to vanish. Their home was immaculate, every surface gleaming, and their laughter was sharp, rehearsed, and hollow. I realized quickly that this family did not welcome outsiders. They tested them, dissected them, and left them exposed if they failed to measure up. As the evening progressed, the subtle barbs began. Comments about my attire, my manners, my cooking, even the way I held my hands. I nodded politely, laughed when they expected laughter, but every insult felt like a small knife twisting inside me. I could feel my jaw tighten, my hands clenching, but I forced myself to remain composed. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. The humiliation escalated further at dinner. They arranged the seating so that I was at the farthest corner, away from conversation, isolated from connection. Every anecdote I tried to share was interrupted with laughter, not because it was funny, but because they wanted to highlight my ignorance, to emphasize the gap between their world and mine. I felt small, insignificant, yet painfully exposed. And I noticed the way they watched me, as if my reactions were a form of entertainment, their amusement growing with every second of my discomfort. I walked through that evening pretending to be meek, pretending to accept their judgments, pretending to be a naive, humble mother. But inside, I was taking notes. Every sneer, every whispered joke, every dismissive glance was recorded in my mind. I realized then that if I wanted to survive this family, if I wanted to gain the respect my son and I deserved, I could not confront them openly. I had to be patient, I had to be clever, and I had to wait for the right moment to turn the tables. That night, as I returned home, I closed the door behind me and let out a long, quiet sigh. I was exhausted, humiliated, but not defeated. I had learned one critical lesson. Appearances could deceive. Patience could be a weapon, and revenge, if planned carefully, could taste sweeter than anyone could imagine. I promised myself then, under the dim light of my kitchen, that I would make them regret ever underestimating me. If you have ever been judged, underestimated, or humiliated by people who thought they were better than you, hit that like button and subscribe now. This story is about patience, cunning, and the sweetest form of justice. Stick around because what happens next is proof that even the quietest, most underestimated people can leave the loudest impact in. You will not want to miss a single moment. The following weeks were far more exhausting than I had imagined. Every visit to Emily's family home became a subtle battlefield, each interaction another test of my patience and composure. Their cruelty was never overt at first, but it was in every glance, every sigh, every carefully chosen word. It was as though they were constantly measuring me, waiting for me to falter, delighting in my discomfort. I smiled when they expected it, nodded when they expected obedience, and kept my thoughts carefully guarded. Yet inside, the anger grew, a slow-burning fire that refused to die. At first, the insults were small, almost innocent on the surface. Margaret would comment on my dresses, questioning if I understood the proper way to cook or set a table, as if my years of managing a household did not exist. "Oh, you made this dish? How charming. It is very simple, is it not?" she said one evening, her lips curved in a smile that did not reach her eyes. I smiled back, hiding my irritation, but my fists ached to clench and my teeth ground together in quiet fury. Richard, who had seemed indifferent initially, began to participate in his own quiet way. He commented on my furniture, my taste in decorations, and even subtly criticized my son, implying that I had raised him without sophistication. At family gatherings, I noticed the younger siblings exchanging glances and smirks when I spoke, whispering behind their hands. Their laughter felt sharp against my ears, like shards of glass slowly cutting through patience I did not know I possessed. I wondered if they even realized how cruel they were, or if cruelty was simply a part of who they were. Emily, my daughter-in-law, became a master of passive aggression. She would make small remarks about my son's upbringing, about the traditions I had taught him, always framed as innocent observations. Rachel always did things a little differently, did she not?" she would say, tilting her head and smiling. I could see the satisfaction in her eyes as I struggled to respond gracefully, to remain composed. Every interaction left me drained, my confidence eroded, yet I refused to allow them to see the depth of my frustration. Then came the more deliberate moments, the orchestrated incidents designed to humiliate me publicly. At one family lunch, they intentionally seated me at the corner, far from conversation, and shared stories that completely excluded me. When I attempted to join in, my words were met with polite, dismissive nods, as though I had not spoken at all. I felt invisible, yet painfully exposed, the center of their unspoken judgment. I could see the way they watched me, as if my reactions were a form of entertainment, their amusement growing with every second of my discomfort. Even my son, who adored me, seemed powerless against their subtle torment. He whispered apologies in private, but he could not shield me from their calculated cruelty. I realized then that if I wanted justice, I could not rely on anyone else. I had to be the architect of my own redemption. At night, I lay awake, replaying every encounter, every smirk, every cutting comment. I began to see patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities. Their arrogance, their belief that they were untouchable became my roadmap. I reminded myself that patience could be more dangerous than anger, that silence could conceal a storm waiting to break. By the end of the month, the tension had escalated to a point where their cruelty was almost unbearable. I could feel anticipation building inside me, a mixture of fear, excitement, and determination. I had endured their insults long enough. I had allowed them to believe that I was weak, naive, and harmless. They did not know that I had been taking careful notes, that I had been planning. And the moment was coming when they would realize exactly how wrong they had been. I had reached a point where patience was no longer enough. Every visit to Emily's family felt like a calculated test, each interaction designed to wear me down. I could no longer pretend that the polite smiles and nods were sufficient armor. Something inside me shifted one evening, and I realized that enduring quietly was no longer an option. The constant undermining, the whispering laughter, the subtle cutting remarks had gone too far. I felt small, yes, but more than that, I felt a rage that demanded action. It happened during a Sunday dinner. I had arrived wearing a simple dress, my hair neatly pulled back, and carried a small dessert I had prepared myself. Soon as I entered the dining room, I noticed the smirks, the exchanged glances. Margaret made a comment about the dessert before I could even set it on the table. "Oh, Rachel made something? How quaint," she said, her words dripping with condescension. Emily smiled, nodding as though in agreement, and I felt every nerve in my body tense. For the first time, I allowed myself to notice the injustice, not just as a passing annoyance, but as a systematic effort to belittle me. Every insult, every exclusion, every moment of subtle ridicule had built a record, a pattern of disrespect that they believed would go unnoticed. But it had not gone unnoticed. I could see clearly how carefully they had constructed this facade of superiority, how completely they underestimated me. And the realization hit me like a physical blow. They were wrong. They had underestimated me entirely, and it was their arrogance that would be their downfall. I excused myself quietly and went to the kitchen, breathing heavily, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. Memories of the previous weeks flashed through my mind, the dismissive comments, the laughter that cut too sharply, the feeling of being invisible and insignificant. And with each memory, my resolve strengthened. I would not allow them to continue this behavior unchecked. I would not let my son see his mother humiliated in front of his family. That night, I began to formulate a plan, not a rash, impulsive plan, but a careful, deliberate strategy. I had observed their weaknesses, their arrogance, their belief that they were untouchable. I had noted the way they flaunted wealth, the way they judged others to feel superior, the way they relied on appearances to command respect. These observations became my blueprint. Every insult they had thrown, every subtle act of cruelty would now be turned against them, but not with recklessness. It would be precise, calculated, and devastatingly effective. I also understood that timing would be everything. Acting too soon could alert them, allow them to defend themselves, or worse, undermine the impact of what I had planned. I needed to be patient, to wait for the perfect opportunity. But I also knew that the longer I waited, the more satisfying the eventual revelation would be for them, and for me. I would demonstrate in the most undeniable way that their assumptions about me were not only wrong, but dangerously so. By the end of that night, I had made a silent promise to myself. No longer would I endure. No longer would I be polite, humble, or invisible. Every slight, every smirk, every whisper of mockery would be remembered, cataloged, and used as fuel for what was coming. I would take control, not with brute force, but with precision and cunning. I would show them that the quiet, underestimated mother-in-law they mocked could orchestrate a form of justice that they would never see coming. As I went to bed, I felt a sense of clarity I had never experienced before. My anger had transformed into purpose. The storm I had kept hidden for so long was now gathering strength, and I knew it would break at the right moment. They had built a world where they believed they were untouchable. I intended to show them exactly how wrong they had been. I began quietly. That was the most important part. Nothing about my behavior changed on the surface. I still smiled. I still dressed modestly. I still spoke softly and thanked Margaret for every invitation as if it were an honor. They believed I was unchanged, still the naive, unassuming woman who absorbed disrespect without question. That illusion was my greatest weapon. The first step was observation. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed how Margaret loved to brag about their social status, how she mentioned her charity connections and elite gatherings with a tone that demanded admiration. I noticed how Richard prided himself on his business image, how he enjoyed being perceived as powerful and untouchable. And Emily thrived on validation. She loved attention, approval, and the feeling of being superior. Their weaknesses were as loud as their arrogance. I began asking harmless questions. Simple, curious questions. The kind that sounded innocent. What charity events do you attend, Margaret? How did you build such an impressive reputation, Richard? Emily loved explaining things to me, loved speaking slowly as if I were incapable of understanding. Each answer gave me another piece of the puzzle. I went home after each visit and wrote everything down. Names, events, dates, connections. Their pride had made them careless. They assumed I was too insignificant to use the information. The second step was preparation. I began reconnecting with people from my past, friends I had not spoken to in years, former colleagues, community leaders, people who knew my real story, people who respected me. I did not boast. I did not reveal my intentions. I simply rebuilt bridges quietly. And with each connection, my confidence grew. I upgraded myself without upgrading my appearance. That was deliberate. I attended workshops. I volunteered at organizations they admired. I positioned myself in circles they believed I could never access. And yet, when I saw them, I still wore my plain dresses and carried my humble smile. Then came the third step, timing. Margaret announced a large charity gala, the kind of event where reputations were displayed like trophies. She mentioned it casually with the tone of someone who expected admiration. "It will be a very high-profile gathering," she said. I nodded, pretending I barely understood. That sounds lovely," I replied. Inside, my heart raced. This was it. This was the stage. I asked if I could attend. Margaret hesitated for half a second. That hesitation told me everything. She did not want me there. But refusing would look cruel in front of others. "Course," she said. "If you would like that night," I did not sleep. I reviewed every detail, every connection I had built, every quiet step I had taken. I contacted the people I had reconnected with and confirmed their attendance. I ensured introductions would be made naturally, casually, without drama. The day of the event arrived. I dressed simply, as always. No jewelry, no luxury, no transformation. Because my power was not in my appearance. It was in what I carried silently within me. When we arrived, I could feel their confidence fill the room. Margaret walked proudly. Emily followed, glowing with expectation. Richard nodded at people who greeted him with respect. And then there was me, walking a step behind, unnoticed, exactly where I wanted to be. The plan unfolded slowly, perfectly. I allowed them to introduce me dismissively. "This is Rachel, my son-in-law's mother," Emily said, as if that were all I was. And then the first shift happened. Someone recognized me, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make Margaret pause. "Rachel, from the Foundation Committee." I smiled calmly. Yes, that is me. I watched their expressions change, slightly at first. A flicker of confusion, a hint of disbelief. Throughout the evening, it continued. Another greeting, another recognition, another whispered conversation. Each moment was a quiet strike. Each reaction was a crack in their confidence. I remained calm, gracious, humble. They had spent months believing I was invisible. That night, invisibility became power. The moment arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it carried the weight of months of planning. The gala was in full swing, chandeliers casting a soft golden light over polished floors and expensive decor. Margaret floated through the crowd, radiant, expecting admiration. Richard shook hands with people who nodded respectfully at him, the king of his carefully curated empire. Emily moved like a queen, subtly demanding attention, smiling at anyone who praised her. They had assumed they were untouchable. They had assumed I was insignificant. They were wrong. I remained composed, moving through the room with a quiet confidence that made no one think twice. My dress was simple, my expression calm, my presence unassuming. And yet everything had changed. I had spent months building influence in their world, gathering allies they did not even know existed, learning the networks they prized, quietly earning respect in the very circles they flaunted as unattainable. The first strike came as a casual introduction. A respected philanthropist, someone Margaret had spoken of endlessly, approached me. "Rachel, it is wonderful to finally meet you. I have heard about your work with the community project. Your contributions are remarkable." Margaret froze mid-step, her lips pressed tightly together. Richard's handshake paused, and Emily's perfectly rehearsed smile faltered. I could see the subtle shock on their faces, the realization that the quiet, unassuming mother-in-law they had dismissed as naive was someone they had underestimated entirely. I smiled politely, nodding. "Thank you. It has been rewarding to see the impact." Throughout the evening, the effect multiplied. People I had quietly contacted, respected individuals in charity, business, and social circles began to approach me. Each introduction carried admiration, validation, and acknowledgement. Whispers followed me wherever I went. Margaret tried to interject, claiming connection or authority over introductions, but it was clear she was no longer in control. Every recognition, every compliment was a small humiliation for her. And I could see it in the tightening of her jaw, the shifting of her posture, the way her eyes darted to me with disbelief. Emily attempted to regain her composure. She smiled, spoke, tried to redirect attention to herself. It was ineffective. Every time she tried to assert superiority, another person acknowledged me instead. Every attempt at control slipped through her fingers like water. Richard's pride faltered as he realized that the careful image of dominance he had cultivated was crumbling in real time. The family's veneer of perfection cracked under the weight of my quiet, methodical rise. I moved through the room deliberately, acknowledging each person with humility and grace, absorbing their admiration without arrogance. And with each interaction, I felt the tension in my chest release, the months of humiliation, the whispered insults. The deliberate exclusion, all of it, was dissolving in the recognition I was receiving. The fire that had simmered within me now burned with satisfaction, controlled and victorious. At one point, Margaret whispered to Emily, her voice tight and low, "How? How is she?" Emily's lips parted in shock, but she could not answer. She had no words. Richard looked on silently, the faintest shadow of doubt crossing his expression. Their carefully constructed superiority had been dismantled, piece by piece, not through confrontation, but through strategy, patience, and the undeniable proof of my worth. I paused in the center of the room, letting the moment settle. The soft murmur of recognition surrounded me. I closed my eyes briefly, inhaling the air, feeling the adrenaline and triumph surge through my body. Relief washed over me. I had endured humiliation, had remained patient, had waited for the perfect moment, and now it was complete. No yelling, no confrontation, no dramatics. It's just undeniable validation. It's just the silent, crushing truth. I was not insignificant. I was respected. And they had underestimated me at their own peril. The moment lingered. Margaret's shoulders drooped. Emily's confident posture slumped. Richard's hand unconsciously clenched. And I stood quietly, triumphant, a calm smile on my lips, savoring the sweet, quiet power of my victory. For the first time in months, I felt completely free. Sitting alone in my home the night after the gala, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a quiet satisfaction that was deeper than anything I had felt in years. Months of humiliation, subtle cruelty, and careful observation had culminated in a single night of undeniable justice. I could not help but reflect on the journey, on the patience it had required, and on the lessons I had learned about people and about myself. First, I understood the power of patience. For so long, I had thought that enduring silently was a weakness, a sign that I was powerless. But in reality, patience had been my greatest weapon. Every insult, every smirk, every dismissive glance had been fuel. I had observed, learned, and strategized while they believed I was fragile and naive. In that stillness, I had built something stronger than anger. A quiet certainty, a plan that would not fail. Karma had not needed to act for me. I had acted, and it had worked flawlessly. Second, I realized that respect cannot be demanded from those who do not understand its value. Margaret, Richard, and Emily had assumed that appearances, wealth, and social influence made them untouchable. They had relied on arrogance, assuming that a quiet, humble woman could not disrupt their carefully controlled world. They were wrong. Respect is earned through action, through strategy, and through this subtle assertion of power that others never see coming. That night, in the golden light of the gala, their assumptions shattered. I also understood the importance of knowing one's own worth. For too long, I had allowed their judgments to make me doubt myself, to question my place in the world. But every moment of humiliation reminded me of the value of resilience. I had cultivated strength, intellect, and influence quietly, away from their gaze. I had learned that power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it walks in quietly, smiles politely, and leaves others speechless in its wake. Most importantly, I recognized the beauty of precise, controlled justice. There was no need for confrontation, no need for public displays of anger or vengeance. True satisfaction comes from the quiet moments when those who believed themselves superior realize they have underestimated someone entirely. The thrill was in watching their world, built on arrogance and neglect, crumble silently as I maintained composure. The justice I had orchestrated was fair, inevitable, and deeply rewarding. I will not forgive them because they do not deserve it. Forgiveness is for those who show remorse or understanding, and there was none of that in their actions. My satisfaction came not from hatred, but from clarity, strategy, and the acknowledgement that I had claimed my power without losing myself in cruelty. The story of that night will remain with me. A reminder that intelligence, patience, and careful planning can transform humiliation into triumph. I have moved forward since then, carrying my lessons with me. I remain humble, but I am no longer naive. I smile, I nod, I observe, but I never forget. I know now that patience is a weapon, strategy is power, and the quietest individuals often have the most devastating impact. The past no longer haunts me. The future, however, is mine to shape in. I will shape it deliberately, carefully, and with the knowledge that I am never to be underestimated again. If this story left your heart racing, smash that like button. Tell us in the comments your most satisfying revenge story, and subscribe for more gripping tales where patience, strategy, and justice collide. Remember, the quietest people can have the loudest impact.